Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced and welcome to video number 4 in this Intro to React 18 course. And in this video, what I want to do is we're going to talk about uncontrolled forms, mainly because I want to show you what happens in our journey talking about state. I want to show you what happens when the user does certain things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify and clean all this out. Okay. I want to just change the way we're kind of doing this going forward. Okay. So I'm just going to clean all this out. Okay. Actually, here's what I'm going to do. Bring some of that stuff back. First, I'm going to commit this, so that way it's in the repo. So if you go in the video description, there's like a repo of like all code from all my videos, and this is going to be like in the React 18 101, actually in this React 18 folder. So just look for that folder in that repo. So I'm going to say pushy videos 1 and through 3. That'll be the commit. Okay, and if you're wondering what pushy is, it's a custom command I did that adds commits and pushes. Okay, cool. And then going forward, I'll make a commit for each video. So at the end of each video, I'll do a commit, so that way you can actually see, like, look for the commit that goes with that video and see the code as it was at the end of that video. Okay, so here we go. I'm gonna get rid of all this stuff. I'm not gonna need it. I'm gonna get rid of I'm gonna get rid of just basically all of this stuff. Okay, I'm gonna get rid of all of this. And I'm gonna get rid of all of this. So what I'm gonna do is, for going forward for each video, I'm gonna make a component, and that component will be sort of self-contained. So new file, we're gonna call this uncontrolled form.js. Okay. So again, we're gonna export default uncontrolled form. Again, that's going to be a function that takes in props because that's what components do, and it's going to return some JSX. So I always just kind of like just do the basic template of a component. Where did I go? Oh, I've got the function keyword. Function. There we go. Return h1 hello uncontrolled form. Because I always like to make sure that I'm exporting the component, so I can see, okay, here I have the component, good, and it's exported. Now I just want to make sure that works, so I'm going to head over to app. I'm going to import it. Import uncontrolled form, and then we're going to just stick it right here. Okay, and then let me just turn on the server. Close some of these extra tabs. And you see the component is being rendered on the screen. Good. Okay, that should always be like the first thing you do with any component. Like, I make the shell, I just make sure that I can see it. So, because what's going to happen is that you might get like really deep into making it, and then you realize it's not rendering at all, and you think it's something else you did wrong. So first, just make sure that the component renders just some text. So that way, at least you know you exported it correctly and you imported it correctly. So you establish that anything going wrong going forward is actually your code in the component, not just the fact that you exported or imported it wrong. Okay, it's always incremental steps. Okay, so now I can work out of here, no problem. Okay, and what I'm going to do is we're going to do what's called an uncontrolled form. Yeah, uncontrolled form. Which just means that technically we're not going to use state to track the data on the form. How to do a controlled form is a little bit more complicated. Will be in a later video. But this is going to be like a simple state thing. So an uncontrolled form is going to be better for this. So what we're going to do is we're going to want to import useState because we're going to be using the useState hook. We're also going to be using the useRef hook. And we'll learn about what the useRef hook is. And that's all being imported from React. Okay. Now what the useRef hook is, it's going to allow us to, it's basically like, think of like if you ever use jQuery or you use plain vanilla DOM manipulation, in plain JavaScript you use like query selector to grab a DOM element so that way you can reference it. That is what useRef does. It allows us, it gives us a way to say, hey, I would like this DOM element in a variable so I can manipulate it like I would normally manipulate a DOM element in plain JavaScript. So the way this would work is so what's going to happen is that we're going to have an input box. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to make a div. inside this div, let me get rid of this extra character there. We're going to have an input box of type equals text. Okay. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that even inputs need to have a closing bracket. So see, there's our input. And actually, I want it to be of type number. Okay. And we're going to have an h1 here that's going to have some data inside of it. So first off, we're going to kind of declare that variable again, the counter. Okay, so const counter set counter equals, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use it as do it as an object again. So I'm going to say, hey, it's actually an object. Inside that object is a property called value, which equals 1 to start off with. Okay, so technically what we want to do is in the h1 we want to show counter.value, because again right now counter equals this object, and this object has a property called value. That's what I want to show on the screen. Okay, and I'm going to want to have a function called add1 will update that value. So again, when we're updating an object, we want to make sure we create a new object, so that way, because again, if I pass the same object again, even if I update the object, it's not going to re-render, as discussed in the previous video. So essentially what I want to do is again create like a new state. So I'm going to make a copy of the object. So make a new object and make sure it's a copy of the original counter object. Okay. But what I'm going to do is that instead of changing it to, +1, I'm going to change it to whatever we have in this box. Okay. So actually, technically, I should just call this change value. Okay, that probably make more sense. Again, naming is one of the most important things in coding, making sure that you name your functions and variables what they are. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to take count new state dot value, and it should equal whatever the value of that input box. But how am I supposed to grab that input box? This is where the useRef hook comes in. So I'm going to say const input. So this is going to represent the input box equals useRef, and you just pass null. Okay, basically this just creates the ref. And then what I do is I go over here to the input and I will assign the ref. So I'll say ref equals, and I pass it that variable input. Okay. And now what I can do is I can say like input dot current dot value, and I'll show you what that is. Okay. But just to show you what I mean by that, console.log input. So what do you get when we have that ref? Okay, and then actually let me just then say set counter. We're going to update the state, and the new basically the state will now equal the new state going forward. Okay, and then again we want to make that happen anytime we click on a button. So we'll create a button, update state, and then we're going to say, hey, whenever you click this button, on click equals the function we want to run, which is going to be change value. Okay, now let me open up the console. So I'm going to say, hey, I want to change this to 5. Okay. So now see, when I clicked on the function change value, I console logged input. So see, input equals this object that has a variable called current, or a property called current. Current actually holds the input node. So that node that we were referring to, the ref, is referring to the input. So the input is the current. So technically, input.current is the input box. And just like any input box would have in normal JavaScript, it has a value prop that is the value inside the box. So that's why when I'm saying input.value, I'm saying the value inside the input box. So what happens is that when I pass this object, I'm saying it now equals an object with the value property equals 5. And I can actually see that. So if I go to components, let's refresh this. I go to uncontrolled forms, so you can see, I can see how this child uncontrolled form, see there's where the state exists. And I can also see that anytime you see a hook, you use a hook, you should be able to see it here. So I can see, hey, look, there's a ref that's referring to the input, and I see there's state, and the state is an object with a value of 1. Now if I change this to, let's say, 7, I click update state, And see, now it's an update value with a value of the state of 7. Now notice it's the string of 7. So I made a mistake somewhere. Okay, why? Because let's take a look at my input. Well, it is of type number, so it should be treated as a number. So why is it treating as a string? That's funky. So what we can do is just to make sure that it is treated as a number, we can always just use like, we can either use like parse int, we can use, there's a couple different ways you can do this. I can use the parse int function, like that. Okay, and what that's going to do is just make sure that whatever that is turns it into a number. So now if I refresh and I change this to 7, I can take a look over here. If I hit update 7, see now it's not a string of 7. See, I don't see those quotation marks. I see a 7. Like, and these are the kind of things you always, another reason why you always want to look at DevTools, because sometimes you think you're bringing in the number of 7, but you're actually bringing in the string of 7, and that can cause issues later on when you have issues between different types of data, and they don't play together well. Okay, because I might be trying to like multiply or divide somewhere later, and that's not going to work really well with a string. Okay, so now I caught that. I can fix that. I could also use the number constructor, so I could go over here and just change this to number. And what that's going to do is just take whatever's inside the parentheses and turn it into a number. That should also work. And see, it works. Okay, so either one of those ways would then again convert that to a number. Okay, cool. So we caught that. But again, let's just kind of look at the renders. So again, I'm going to just, every time this function runs, this function should only run when there's a render. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a console.log that says rendered. Okay, so anytime this function renders, see, I'm going to see rendered. Okay, so now if I click on, but so if I say let's change this to 4, okay, rendered. And let's say I change it to 3, rendered. And see, this is updating here. But what if I change it to the same value? What if I keep it at 3? You think it would not update, because again, we learned in the previous video that it shouldn't update if the value is the same. But it's still rendered. Why? The reason being is that we're technically still creating, okay, we are still creating a new object. So even though the value is the same, so again, this case is, even if I put the same couch in a new house, it's a new house. Okay, so again, the object is a house, the properties inside the object are the furniture inside the house. The house is what needs to change. And since the house did change, I created a new object, but it has the same properties with the same values, you're still going to trigger a new render of the component. Okay, so in that case, here's where you might want to do, like, you might have to do a little bit more complex logic. So what if I want to kind of optimize this so that way it doesn't do that? Okay, I may actually want to create like a check. So I may want to say like, hey, if, okay, or should we want to do this? Probably. Now let's wait to over here and say if counter.value, so the original version, equals does not equal counter new state.value. So basically only if they're not the same should we update the state. So if they are not the same, this if won't run. Okay, so let's try that again. So it's this, because it's a set counter that triggers the new render. So in this case, I'm trying to be careful and optimize the amount of times my component updates by saying, okay, well, I know that I'm creating a new object every time, so theoretically this is going to update every time. So I don't want to update when it doesn't change, and again, react when it comes to objects. This is why generally your state shouldn't be an object if you can help it, or an array. If you can help it, there are situations where you can't help that. But in this case, it's going to be the same. So now I can be like, okay, when I update that's different. But let's say here I keep it at 2, and you see like no more, I'm not seeing that rendered console log anymore because it's skipping this because they're the same. So I've optimized the renders on my app. Again, if you just avoid using objects as your state or arrays as your state, you can avoid a lot of this complexity. Again, there are going to be times where you can't avoid it, and there's going to be a lot of times where you can't avoid it where it's not necessary. Because technically, anytime your state does change, because of the way you design your app, you are going to change the array or you are going to change the object. But in this situation, again, the user is deciding what the number is. So there's a chance that the user keeps it on 6 and then just hits the button a few times. I don't want additional renders. So since I'm aware of that potential situation, I plan for it and say, okay, if. You don't have to. But again, these are little ways you can think about how to optimize your app as you build out your app. So takeaways for this video, again, it's just like the difference between working as an individual number, because again, if it's an individual number, a primitive, a number, a boolean, a string, React does that check for you. It's going to check, hey, are they the same value? If not, don't re-render. If it's an object or an array, it's only checking if the object is the same object or the array is the same array, not whether the values in the object or the array are the same or not. Which means if you pass it the same object with different values, it won't update. But if you pass it a new object with the same properties, it will update. Okay, so we've now seen sort of both scenarios and kind of different ways you can deal with them. Okay, and again, if that seemed like a lot, it's a lot. I would say there's probably a lot of really advanced React developers who still struggle with that aspect of optimization. But now you are aware, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do it right every time, but being aware of these potential challenges helps you prevent. The other big takeaway is how to use the useRef hook. So again, the useRef hook, all we do is we just create a ref, a variable, and then we just assign that ref to any HTML element, okay, as we saw here, and then I can use that variable. So whatever that variable's name .current is the DOM node, and I can use that DOM node to do like imperative JavaScript stuff, like changing its style property or getting different, anything you would normally do in normal JavaScript when it comes to like selecting DOM nodes, you can now do using that ref variable. Ideally, you should not be changing too much. You really want to depend on your state and your component re-rendering to do major changes. But again, grabbing like the value of an input, this is kind of like a good use case for ref. But the thing, just keep in mind that if you try to do too much with that DOM node directly, you're kind of circumventing the React render process, which can have unintended consequences. So I wouldn't grab a node and try to do too many changes in that way. I would try to find other ways to change that node using state. Basically by passing it different properties, or there's different ways of doing it. Okay, we'll kind of explore that more. But basically now you know how a useRef hook works. And now I think we've kind of explored like the deeper depths of just kind of like being able to understand like state changes. Again, state always changes whenever you use the set function. And as again, it's a shallow comparison. So it's comparing the direct value to the direct value. So it's got to be a different object, got to be a different array, a different string, a different number, whatever, compared to what the original value was. So I will actually, let me push this up to GitHub. Okay, and this is called an uncontrolled form because the value of the form, that input, is being accessed via a ref. In the next video, we might as well do a controlled form so you can see the difference, where basically we're going to grab the value of the form inputs and store them in state instead. It's a little bit more complicated, but generally it's more of the time it's going to be a better way to do things. This is good for like simple like one input forms or something simple. I wouldn't do this for something more complicated, as you'll see in the next video. Uncontrolled forms, origin main. So this commit will be up there so you can look through the commits and see that commit. I'll see you all in the next video.